2024 Formula One season wrapped up in December, we've needed plenty of time to decompress, to take a step back and look at what a year that was. While there will always be drama and chaos on the circuit, there's plenty off camera too. So we're going to dive into all the biggest scandals of the Formula One 2024 season. But before we do that, don't forget to like and subscribe to the talkSPORT driving page. Joining me now to walk us through this all is talkSPORT driving reporter Jon Jackson. Jon, the first big scandal of 2024 season happened in February when it was revealed that a female Red Bull employee had accused team principal Christian Horner of inappropriate and coercive behaviour. Can you break this down for me and how it affected Red Bull's season?
I can indeed. So when you're launching a new car for the new season and you're the reigning world champions and you've got the reigning world champion driver on your team, the last thing you need is anything that's going to disrupt things. But I think for Red Bull, things behind the scenes have always been a little fraught. The relationships between Jos Verstappen, for example, Max Verstappen's dad, and team principal Christian Horner have always been a little bit frosty. You have the team advisor, Helmut Marko, who has a huge hand and a huge say in which drivers make their way to their 4 different teams that Red Bull own. And everything kind of came to a head, but we weren't expecting this. So it all started on the 5th of February, where Red Bull released a statement saying that after being made aware of certain recent allegations, the company launched an independent investigation. Now, as you said there, the accusations were of sexual harassment, coercive and abusive behavior by a female employee. She'd made these claims against Christian Horner. So the timeline looks a little bit like this. Christian Horner completely denied the claims made against him straight away, and actually throughout this whole situation. The statement from Red Bull, the parent company of Red Bull Racing, went on to say that this process, which is already underway, is being carried out by an external specialist barrister. The company takes these matters extremely seriously, and the investigation will be completed as soon as practically possible. It would not be appropriate to comment further at this time. So very much being taken on from a legal perspective. But the important thing here is that it's from an external barrister. So an external person is coming in and looking at this situation and these very serious allegations. They then had 10 days later the car launch at the Red Bull factory in Milton Keynes. And obviously, when we're journalists, we're going along to this thinking, well, there's no way that Christian Horner, while these allegations are being made, will be there. But actually, this was quite the opposite. He was there front and center alongside Max Verstappen, Sergio Perez, and at the time, Adrian Newey, the chief technical director, the designer of all the Red Bull cars that have had such massive success. And actually, he spoke to talkSPORT and gave what was a very pre-prepared and very legally advised statement that he was giving to all media outlets.
Can I just ask as well, how are things with you and how difficult has the last week been for you as well?
Well, look, I'm fine. It's business as normal. I'm focused on the season ahead, and obviously today's a big day, but looking forward to seeing the cars on track next week in Bahrain.
So that's what Christian Horner said to talkSPORT when we spoke to him at the car launch at the factory for what was going to be a massive season for Red Bull, their 20th season in Formula One. Then the case was dismissed on February the 28th. This was shortly after pre-season testing had taken place in Bahrain. A statement from Red Bull then read that the independent investigation into the allegations made against Mr. Horner is now complete, and Red Bull can confirm that grievances have been dismissed. The complainant has a right of appeal. Red Bull is confident the investigation has been fair, rigorous and impartial. So that was obviously what we assumed to be the end of things. And then a day later, while teams were preparing for the start of the first race of the season, a Google Drive was sent around to journalists and team members from other teams and F1 staff containing what was alleged to have been text messages between Christian Horner and presumably the accuser, with some photos there. And that sent shockwaves through the paddock, as we weren't sure whether that was legitimate, and it was obviously done in a very clever way to try and stir up as much trouble in the Red Bull camp before the start of the season.
Absolutely, Jon. How PR timed is that to be dropping these WhatsApp text messages the day before the season opener to probably one of the most famous people in the F1 kind of arena, but we know that he was obviously cleared by Red Bull, that nothing really wrong had been done, but that, as you say, these text messages are then dropped and released to the public and the media with what we know is probably this unnamed woman that's alleged that Christian Horner acted inappropriately. and sending these photos and her telling him to stop asking to send photos. But how did the woman take the news that he had been found to have done nothing wrong? Did she ever come out publicly or speak to the media?
Well, the woman's never been named. It's been very much kept from the legal side of things hidden, and her anonymity has been kept and stringently respected by people, which is good to see. Obviously, this is a legal case. The woman involved was then suspended by Red Bull on March the 16th for an investigation there. And then basically there was a lot of confusion going on there. We've had a lot of confusion all along this, because obviously we're only seeing as fans and as media one side of things, because it's being taken care of by Red Bull's legal team, where we're just getting speculation. So let's leave all the speculation out of this. The situation we're at now is that the woman was said to have been suspended, as I say, on March the 16th. And then the case was appealed by the lady in question, and it took a long time. It dragged on throughout the season quite a long time, until August the 8th, when the appeal was dismissed. So it's still very much in the background. I'm not entirely sure where it goes next here, but I mean, for Christian Horner, Jerry Horner now, who stood by him the whole way, has constantly been there by his side, and they've been made a showing of being incredibly strong throughout this process. But these kind of allegations have to be taken seriously, and it was looked into by an external barrister. So that's a good thing. It's been good that it's been investigated, but how disruptive has this been for Red Bull behind the scenes? Having said that, they were still started the season pretty well. And I think actually that soon took a lot of the focus away from Christian Horner, because once something has been dismissed, once it's being taken care of by lawyers, there wasn't much that the media could do, and they can only speculate to some degree. So actually the racing did take a focus after a while. And as I say, come August 2024, everything was dismissed.
And during this time, John, how did Christian Horner handle this in the public when he was facing questions from press? Were the press still probing him about it, or was, the Red Bull's kind of results speaking for themselves, and that was the main focus from the media?
I think one thing you have to respect is that Red Bull themselves and Red Bull Racing and the team there did allow Christian Horner to speak. He wasn't advised by PR managers to completely ignore the situation. He addressed the situation, but he did so in a very formal way and said that he couldn't comment, and repeatedly said that he wouldn't be able to comment throughout. So we did get quite a repetition of response from Christian Horner. So he did later, once the accusations and the appeal from the lady in question after his original case was dismissed. After that appeal was concluded and it was dismissed on August the 8th, Christian Horner did do more interviews, maybe giving a little bit more away, but we didn't really ever find out much about how it affected him. We can only speculate how a human would deal with such public scrutiny, and it can't have been pleasant for anyone involved. Obviously, the person making the allegations, Christian Horner being involved, people having to work around this situation at Red Bull as well. So it's been a tricky situation for all involved. And although we saw Red Bull start the season strong, obviously things did start to not go their way throughout the mid-season into the end of the season. It's not really up for me to say how much this situation affected that, but it does play into a wider sort of power battle going on behind the scenes at Red Bull that's been there for many years.
Of course. John, in the same month of February, FIA president he was accused of trying to influence race results in favour of Fernando Alonso for the 2023 season. What did this internal ethics investigation find?
Yeah, so this was an interesting one here. So this was relating to the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix in 2023, where Fernando Alonso got his 100th podium in Formula One. So a really impressive feat for the two-time world champion. He finished the race third. He was then dropped to fourth, and this is all surrounding a penalty for his car being touched by someone when he went in to serve another penalty. So the penalty in question was then withdrawn by the FIA, the governing body of Formula One. And it said that we concluded there was no clear agreement, as was suggested to the stewards previously, that could be relied on to determine that parties had agreed that a jack touching a car would amount to working on a car, which sounds like a load of gobbledygook. Yeah. But basically, when you come in to serve a penalty, you're not allowed, if you have a 5-second penalty, the pit crew are not allowed to make contact with that car for 5 seconds before they can then work on the car, they can change the tires. It was it was claimed that Mohammed bin Sulayem, the president of the FIA, had affected this decision. He'd contacted other members of the FIA to suggest that he personally didn't think that this penalty was just. However, Aston Martin, Fernando Alonso's team, also put up a pretty big fight, saying here that they included video evidence of several different instances of other teams committing the same sort of alleged infraction without being penalised. So all in all, he was demoted to 4th place. He was then reinstated to 3rd place. He did get his 100th podium, and Mohammed bin Sulayem was investigated by the ethics committee, and he was cleared of any wrongdoing whatsoever.
And Jon, what benefit would there be for the FIA boss to have, if he was found, I guess, guilty of helping to overturn this penalty from Alonso, or is it more of just an act that he just thought it was wrong and unfairly given?
I think when you're leading the governing body of a motorsports championship, then obviously you're the top of the tree. And I guess the allegations were that he used his personal opinion to try and affect a race result. Obviously, he was cleared of any wrongdoing. For Alonso, the benefit is obvious. He would have missed out on that podium. And, it's a big accolade to get 100 podiums in Formula One. You have to be world champion level to be getting those kind of numbers. So it's obvious what Alonso would have potentially gained. And obviously, he did get that podium in the end. But as Mohammed bin Sulayem was completely cleared, we can only assume that it was investigated thoroughly, and it was seen that he didn't affect the results without the investigation finding that Alonso wasn't due a penalty in the end. As I've said there with that statement, it kind of sounds like a load of gobbledygook, but they've obviously investigated it, and they found from a sporting point of view that actually the penalty had reason for questioning. So they've taken that penalty away, and he's kept his 3rd place.
But then later in the year, in October 2024, Sulayem then lashed out, saying the British media had convicted him like a trial by public. Did this scrutiny affect his role at all?
I mean, as the season went on, his role was quite interesting, with the FIA having some pretty high-level departures. And I mean, he's not the first person to suggest the British media are creating a villain from them. Obviously, Max Verstappen has been fairly outspoken about the British media before, especially when it comes to his battle with Lando Norris that we've seen in 2024. Obviously, the Dutch media very much favour Max Verstappen, whereas the British media might have a slight bias towards Lando Norris. It's probably quite natural that you support the person representing your country. But for Mohammed bin Sulayem, I mean, that might be his opinion. It might be a little bit of deflection there, but I personally don't think that the British media has necessarily turned him into a villain as such. But there's obviously a bit of I don't know whether it's a power struggle going on behind the scenes at the FIA, but he's certainly got people that he gets on with and people that he perhaps doesn't, as we probably have in every workplace across the world.
Absolutely. Jon, we're staying in February now. This was a sad day for Mercedes fans when 7-time F1 world champ Lewis Hamilton announced that he was moving on to join Ferrari in 2025. How did Mercedes, but how did F1 fans take this news?
I think this is the biggest news, and was the biggest news in Formula One since Lewis Hamilton announced that he'd be leaving McLaren and joining Mercedes back in 2013. It's a huge move. You've got a 7-time world champion deciding that after a very successful stint with the Mercedes team, winning 6 world championships, he's moving. He wants to do something different. And, you have the magic of Ferrari, that team that every driver on the grid, as much as they might not admit to it because of contractual reasons and because they need to show faith to their current team, I think every driver in Formula One and every motor racing fan or driver would love to drive for Ferrari in Formula One. It's that kind of iconic Italian brand. It's a really magical partnership to then have a 7-time world champion teaming up with Ferrari for 2025, which I know a lot of fans are looking forward to, but it was met with a lot of shock, because there had been rumors, I think back until Monaco in 2023, and then later in the season, that Lewis Hamilton's going to make this big shock move. And I don't think anyone really believed it because of his strong relationship with Toto Wolff at Mercedes. As I say, winning 6 world championships there and the success they've had together. But yeah, it was announced, and Lewis Hamilton was off to Ferrari in 2025. Obviously, strange timing to have announced it so early in the season. Presumably someone found out and had good reasoning to suggest that they were going to release it. So he preempted that by announcing it himself. But the partnership in 2025 could be fantastic. Lewis Hamilton made that very clever decision to leave McLaren after 4 years of not winning championships after winning his first championship. He then moved to Mercedes and in his second season started winning championships again. And an interesting point here is that it's been 4 seasons for Lewis at Mercedes since he last won a championship. So it's been 4 years again before he now moves to Ferrari. So will we see a repeat, and will we see Lewis win a championship maybe in his second year at Ferrari in 2026? It's going to be one to watch.
Perhaps a superstition thing, John, but what do you think was the major player in this decision from Hamilton to leave Mercedes after over 10 years since 2013, you mentioned before, and you mentioned also he has such a good relationship with Toto Wolff. You listen to any interview with Toto Wolff and he's always mentioning Lewis. They have a very close relationship, and Lewis is outspoken about how much he does love Mercedes. So what do you think was kind of the main player for him to decide to move? Was it money? Was it kind of an investment in cars that Ferrari would be putting into?
I think there's a few things that could be factors in this, and I actually don't think money is one of them. Lewis Hamilton has plenty of money from his racing and from his sponsors. I think for Lewis, he is a true racing fan, and as I've already outlined, you know, getting an opportunity to go and race for Ferrari, whether you're Lewis Hamilton with 7 world championships or you're Ollie Bearman who stepped into Ferrari for the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix this year, you're going to jump at the chance of being involved in that team. And actually the timing was right for Lewis Hamilton, really, because the relationship at Mercedes has gone on for many, many years now. And as I say, 4 years without a world championship with Max Verstappen dominating, it's kind of a why not? You know, Ferrari have obviously presented what they are planning in 2026 when the car changes, when some regulations change. And he obviously liked what he saw and he thought it was worth making the jump. And we have to appreciate that Lewis Hamilton has made this bold decision to leave McLaren, who were dominating back when he left them, to go and join Mercedes. And everyone thought that was a strange decision. And look at the success he had there. So I think for Lewis, it's about racing. It's about the history of Ferrari and Formula One. And for him, I think he would want to finish his career knowing that he had that opportunity. He took that opportunity. And whether that brings in this elusive 8th world championship or not, at least he took the plunge and went there. And I'm hoping he's learning Italian, because otherwise it could be a bit tricky for him there.
Do you see him finishing his career with Ferrari, John?
I think you would imagine so, given Lewis's age now. He's probably got, you know, 3 or 4 seasons left in him at the peak. Some would say that maybe, you know, he's maybe dropped off a little bit there, but I think it's hard to tell with the Mercedes car not being as competitive. When you look at what Ferrari are doing, they've had multiple race wins this year with both drivers. So it could be that Lewis has made a very smart decision here, because he's still a world championship quality driver and he's joining a team that have been a little bit questionable. They made some strategy errors and questionable decisions when it comes to in-race decisions, but also they have a car that can obviously win races, and Lewis Hamilton knows how to win a race. Put it all together, it could be a really successful partnership. And I think the magic of this for the fans is that we don't actually know. We don't know how it's going to go at the moment. We don't know how his relationship will be with Charles Leclerc. He's used to being the number 1 driver, not on paper, but unofficially at Ferrari. How's that relationship going to go? It's going to make 25 a season to watch out for, just like 2024 has turned out to be.
Absolutely. I think everyone's going to be watching Lewis Hamilton to see him in his new role with his new family. But John, in March this year, all eyes were actually on Williams' decision to eject Logan Sargeant from his car at the Australian Grand Prix in Melbourne in favour of Alex Albon, who had totaled his car in his first practice session. Does this send such a strong message of pecking order for Williams to replace Sargeant in his own car?
It's a really tricky one. Williams are one of the teams in Formula One that have slightly less resource than some of the big boys there. Obviously, Williams are a team that have done very good things in the past, and they're kind of on the way back up now. They've had new investment in the last few years or so. But when it came to car development, they were a little bit behind there. So when it came to Melbourne, Australia, they didn't have the spares that they needed there. So James Vowles, the team principal, had to make a very tricky decision. Now, having spoken to James Vowles on talkSPORT a few times and in the paddock, he is someone that will always come out and explain his decisions, and he will always give full transparency. So you can only imagine the decision and the conversation that went on to Logan Sargeant was fair. And I'm sure James explained his reasoning and made it very clear. And to me, the decision is quite clear that Logan Sargeant is in his second season in Formula One. He's maybe underperforming from what they were expecting of him so far after a very impressive junior career. Alex Albon's been around for many, many seasons now in multiple teams. And for James Vowles, the decision is simple. He felt that Alex Albon would have a better chance of scoring points in that race. So therefore, he had to make that decision. Although heartbreaking for Logan Sargeant, when you look at it away from the track and you have all the heated moments drained away from you, and you look at it from a business decision, which it kind of is, it does make sense. But obviously heartbreaking for Logan Sargeant, and things didn't tend to go his way for the rest of the season, getting replaced.
You mentioned, John, that Williams is not as kind of resourceful as some of the other bigger, more, invested teams. For a team like Mercedes or Ferrari, would it be a normal circumstance for those teams to be able to repair drivers' cars in time for the race with the same kind of damage that the Williams car had?
It all depends, basically, when it comes to repairing cars, on how damaged it is and whether certain parts are significantly damaged beyond repair. So when it came to that particular incident there, they deemed that Logan Sargeant's car was not safe to repair. They needed to replace the entire sort of chassis. So for Williams to not have a spare chassis there, that was the problem there. And as I say, that comes down to development and them just not being able to manufacture that for the start of the season, which is how you're hamstrung slightly as a smaller team. Now, if that had happened to Red Bull, the same incident, the same amount of damage, then they would have had a spare chassis there. So they would have been able to bring that in. It would have been a big job for the mechanics, but they would have been able to turn that around. It comes down to simply, if you haven't got the basis of the car available, then you can't repair a car that is in effect written off. When it comes down to Williams, actually, you have to give them credit, because later in the season, there were races where we did see some big smashes. Franco Colapinto had a couple where there was significant damage as he came in to replace Logan Sargeant, and they turned around both cars at one of the races in amazing time. The pundits on the TV were writing them off and saying they didn't think both cars would get on the grid. And actually, you have to give them credit, because when these mechanics are put under this pressure, they can turn things around at amazing speed. And you have to actually put yourself in that position there. If you're after qualifying on a Saturday and your car has been totaled and you've got, so many hours, 14 hours or so to turn that car around to be on the grid, it's not a case of, well, I've worked my 8 hours today. They have to get in there. They will be there as long as they possibly can be within the regulations in that garage, fixing that car to get that driver in it. So there's been instances many, many times with many teams where mechanics have had all-nighters. They barely slept. They've, ordered in pizza or takeaway to get them through the night. And actually, drivers are very respectful of this, because they're putting them back on the grid. And we've seen drivers actually from the junior series that I work with all the way up to elite motorsport like Formula One, where the drivers will buy gifts or get the food in, get the takeaways in, get the coffees in, because in effect the mechanics are making them, getting them back on the grid and giving them the opportunity to race. So they're very grateful for it.
John, over into March now, when 18-year-old Ollie Bearman, he got the call up for the big time when he had to replace Carlos Sainz in Saudi Arabia after the 30-year-old actually had to get his appendix removed. Can you walk me through this? I can imagine this would be the most chaotic, stressful few hours to make this decision, to have one of your big driver be so sick that he'd have to go to hospital and actually have an emergency appendix removal.
Yeah, an appendix one is quite a tricky one, because sometimes the symptoms don't present themselves as what it actually is. And I guess that Carlos Sainz wasn't feeling great for the whole weekend, but he did manage 2 practice sessions. And then obviously they realized what it was. He was rushed for surgery, and it's a fairly simple procedure, but it's also something, you don't want to be getting in a Formula One car when you're feeling like that. It can come with fevers and all kinds of things there, from the experience I've had with my friends having that problem. But for Ollie Bearman, I'll say this now, reserve drivers, whether you're at any level of motorsports, they are ready, or they should be ready, to step into that car at a moment's notice. So though it might seem like a daunting and stressful thing, Ollie Bearman has been around motorsports since he was a very, very small kid. He's also been very successful in his junior career. He's been in the Formula One car before in a free practice. He knows that car, and actually it may have played into his favor that he wasn't given much time to prepare. He was put in a couple of hours before the final practice in a Ferrari, which is a pretty big deal here. It's not like the Haas that he later drove in the season. This is Ferrari, and you are under pressure to perform. Realistically, there's no pressure on him because we know he's an 18-year-old stepping in at the last minute. But to do what he did and, qualify 11th for that race on his, second time driving that Ferrari car on that track, and actually Saudi Arabia is one of the sort of most physically demanding tracks, is a serious achievement for Ollie Bearman. And I think it stands him in good stead for his career and his first full-time drive in 2025 with Haas.
Was it safe to say, John, that Bearman was just a complete underdog that over-delivered in his first F1 race? We saw Lewis Hamilton commend him on that amazing achievement. I mean, did anyone expect him to do that well?
Yeah, I've got the quote from Lewis here. He said he's done an incredible job and he should be extremely proud of himself. To score points in his first F1 race, starting 11th and gaining positions is a huge effort. I would go on to say that starting 11th in his first race and getting points with zero notice, really, a matter of hours notice, given that other drivers will have had an off season to prepare, is even more impressive. When you look at the car and when you look at drivers, if you're an F1 reserve driver, I think the general consensus is from drivers and pundits that realistically, you should be able to get in that car and get good lap times out of it. I think it would come down to your racecraft and how it translates across from the series that you have been driving in. So Ollie Bearman had been driving in F2 in 2024. To give you some idea around that particular track, the F1 car is 14 seconds quicker. So if you think that's not a particularly long track, to make up 14 seconds of time, that gives you an idea of just how much quicker the Formula One car is, how much quicker you'll be doing each turn. So for him, it just shows that he's obviously ready for Formula One, because to step in, to manage the physicality of everything there, and also to get out of this car what he got, to get points, to finish 7th and to beat some pretty big name drivers. As I've already said, it really does stand him in good stead. I know he was obviously very well fancied before this opportunity with Ferrari came. It probably helped him get this Haas seat for 2025. And I feel like we're going to have another multiple race winning British driver. I guess the jury's out on whether he's a future world champion, but that's for us to enjoy over the next few seasons.
Absolutely. In May, the Monaco F1, which is probably one of the most popular and prestigious to attend to, ended up being a massive spectacle because there was a multi-car crash. John, can you walk me through what happened here?
Yeah, this was the Kevin Magnussen dive bomb on Sergio Perez. Now, all these drivers involved started towards the back of the grid. And to give you context, I mean, if you're watching this, you've probably heard of the Monaco Grand Prix. If you've never been there, you can walk around this track all year round. It's the streets of Monaco. There's no gimmick here. It is literally the roads that people drive around, and it gets shut down for 3 different race championships every year. And other than that, you can drive your own car around there. Not quite the track of the Formula One circuit. I wouldn't advise that. You'd probably get arrested. But when it comes to that track, it's very, very thin roads. We've got incredible speeds to be going along street circuits with so much around you. There are walls the whole way around. There's no margin for error. So for Kevin Magnussen, who for some reason started at the back of the grid, fancied just making a move on Sergio Perez up the hill after turn 1. I mean, the argument is there that he potentially should have, Sergio Perez should have let Kevin Magnussen have a bit more space, because he did manage to get alongside him. But when you watch the onboards of the cars there, I mean, when you're going around Monaco, to make that kind of move to start with, you're asking for trouble. And that then ended Kevin Magnussen's race as he collided with Sergio Perez. Sergio Perez's car kind of ended with no wheels there, looked like the worse off from it. And then he also took out Nico Hülkenberg, his teammate, as part of it. So from one tiny little split-second decision, you've ruined your entire team's weekend, and you've made Sergio Perez's season, which was unraveling and not going the way he wanted it to, had a terrible start on the streets of Monaco, which is a race that everyone wants to do well at, whether you're from whichever country in the world. And, not ideal for Sergio Perez there at all.
Well, not at all, but then it ended up being a race that broke Charles Leclerc's 39 race winless streak, John.
Yeah, and fantastic for him as well, as he's a Monegasque driver. He's grown up on the streets of Monaco, very proudly from Monaco, and lives there, as a lot of the drivers do. But when you're from that place, to win your home race is a serious achievement for him. And he went on to win other races in the season, but I think that for him is probably the pinnacle of his career so far. The next step for him is can he win a world championship? Some people are tipping him for very much being in the fight in 2025, but to win your home race. And we heard from Oscar Piastri actually earlier in the season on talkSPORT, and the magic that he spoke about when his face lit up talking about the potential of winning in Melbourne and what that would mean to him as a boy from Melbourne. Gives you an idea of how Charles Leclerc was feeling when he won that race. So a huge accolade for him. And I'm sure he'll fancy himself to make it 2 from 2 next year.
Well, speaking of Australians, John, September, it was a tough time for Daniel Ricciardo, who was officially dropped by RB in favour of Liam Lawson, the Kiwi, with just 6 races left in the season. How unconvinced was RB, and I guess Red Bull in general, with Ricciardo's performance to finally let him go?
I think it felt that Red Bull, as a wider company, Red Bull Racing, obviously looking after AlphaTauri as it was before 2024, when they brought Daniel Ricciardo back into the fold, when he became available, when things didn't work out at his previous team, there was always the suggestion that Christian Horner's a massive fan of Daniel Ricciardo. Other people are very high on him. They're going to let him test as much as possible. They're going to see how he compares to see if he's still got it. And at the earliest possible opportunity, they're going to put him into a seat at AlphaTauri. And that's what kind of happened in 2023 when Nick de Vries, who had been the Formula E world champion and very highly rated, didn't really cut the mustard in Formula One. You can argue that he wasn't given enough time. Then Daniel Ricciardo was given this opportunity. Sadly, it just didn't work out. And that's the case, that when you're bringing in a driver and you expect something of them, if you don't feel like they're hitting the targets you need them to, then there's plenty more drivers left. And actually, if you look at Red Bull, they're one of the teams that have a driver academy that's full of talent. There's so many drivers coming through. And Liam Lawson is one of those drivers. He replaced Daniel Ricciardo for some races, starting with Zandvoort, where Daniel Ricciardo broke his hand. And I think for Daniel Ricciardo, that was the beginning of the end, really, because Liam Lawson jumped into that car, got a lot out of that car that maybe Daniel Ricciardo wasn't getting. So as soon as Daniel Ricciardo continued in 2024, the pressure was mounting massively on him. And I think we maybe expected him to be replaced a little bit sooner in the summer break, but it didn't come until after Singapore that Liam Lawson was put into the car. I believe from what I've heard with journalists obviously looking into these situations, that's probably more down to Liam Lawson's contract, and he would have been probably made available to other teams as part of his deal had he not got a Formula One seat confirmed. And I've heard that he was guaranteed a certain amount of races in that team. So obviously that's unconfirmed. But to make that decision at that time to give Liam Lawson the end of the season to prove himself was obviously a strategic decision, because Liam Lawson is now driving for Red Bull next season, replacing Sergio Perez. So I think the plan may have always been to give Liam Lawson a bit of an audition to see how he fared, because there was always the thought that he could step up.
I mean, he's had an insane year and a half, but what do we think the options now are for Daniel Ricciardo for 2025? Is he completely out of F1, any sort of motorsport racing?
His chances of being on the grid in F1 are 0, because the F1 grid is now complete for 2025. Potentially he could get involved with another team there and be a third driver, as he was at Red Bull for a while before he got the race seat with AlphaTauri. I think it's probably unlikely. I think we've seen on Daniel Ricciardo's social media, he was absolutely gutted with the decision. Maybe he's had time to reflect. He's looked back and realized that maybe the time was right and it wasn't working out for him. I think an F1 return is quite unlikely. We spoke to Christian Horner in December 2024, and he was suggesting that he would never rule anything out when it comes to Daniel Ricciardo. We've got Cadillac joining the grid in 2026. If they were looking for a very marketable driver, a very experienced driver, then Daniel Ricciardo may be on that list. So there is a chance we could see him back in Formula One. I would imagine for Daniel, though, I mean, he's really enjoying doing what he's doing with his fashion brand at the moment and seems to just be enjoying a lot of downtime. He's always a guy with a smile on his face. People who have worked with him have told me that, you know, when he was at, for example, McLaren alongside Lando Norris, he would qualify towards the back of the grid, whereas Lando Norris would be in the top 5. While Lando might have been disappointed, Daniel would still be, you know, a breath of fresh air. He'd still be a shining light. He'd still be saying hi to everyone. He'd still be being really positive. Just a really nice dude. And whatever he does now, I think he'll just pick what makes him happy. And if that does involve racing in, for example, NASCAR or IndyCar, he's a huge fan of US motorsports, and I know they love him over there. There's a potential he might want to do the Indy 500. He might want to do Le Mans. I mean, when you're an ex-F1 driver with the amount of race starts that Daniel Ricciardo has, there are tons of opportunities available to you. So he's in a beautiful position where he's made a decent living from Formula One for many years, and he can pick and choose now. And should an opportunity come along that he likes the look of, I feel like he'll jump at it.
John, November was a big month for penalty points and fines. Not only had Max Verstappen received 7 penalty points by November, but then he was also hit with fines for swearing. Can you walk me through what happened here?
Yeah, we've seen a lot of Max Verstappen talking points this year. So we had Max Verstappen, he was fined $44,500 for remarks in a press conference about Red Bull's performance where he used profanity. So when you're in the official FIA press conference, you are speaking to the media, you're being interviewed by a sort of mediator, but then obviously you're there to speak to the press, and the FIA deemed that you shouldn't be swearing. This is another thing coming from Mohammed bin Sulayem, the president of the FIA. He doesn't think that drivers should be swearing. And then we had the argument that Max Verstappen brought to the table that, he was swearing on team radio, and that was deemed to have been ideally, not something that drivers should do. But when you're an elite sports person, whatever sport you're doing, you are going to swear like people swear if they drop something on their foot. It's kind of part of it. And Max was not very happy about this at all. Charles Leclerc also got pulled up on this one, but it was Max that came out and fought it, let's say, whereas Charles kind of kept his head down a little bit. So it was November the 7th then when the Grand Prix Drivers Association, which is the drivers are all part of this, they then released a public statement aimed at the FIA and in particular Mohammed bin Sulayem, asking them, and the big quote that was going around at the time was to treat them like adults, feeling that they're being treated like children. And it said that, they were criticized for swearing, and they needed to maybe emphasize the difference between when you swear when you're trying to insult someone, or it's just language to emphasize a point. And they also want sort of transparency when it comes to drivers getting fined, because I think Max felt that he was made an example of when it came to this swearing, and other drivers perhaps had got away with it. So it was a kind of big argument going on. Max then started in FIA press conferences to give very short answers to people, which I guess some people would say looked a bit petulant, but actually he was making his point, and he was not the only driver that felt this. It was quite clearly the drivers feeling that, look, we're all adults here. We're all driving in a very dangerous sport where, you're one mistake away from potentially being severely injured or even worse. So treat us like adults and don't pull us up for saying a swear word, which was obviously in not Max Verstappen's first language, and also not aimed at anyone. It wasn't said in a derogatory way. It was just to describe the team's performance. So this was kind of the start of a kind of a battle between the drivers and the FIA that we saw towards the end of the season, as many different things went on in Formula One.
It is a bizarre situation to look at from if you're, a follower of any other sporting body. But then Max literally had to carry out community service in Rwanda for swearing. We know what the drivers think about this, John, but what does the public, what does the F1 fans think about this?
I think if you're a fan of any sport, when the football's on and a mic in the crowd picks up a manager maybe swearing, they will apologise because they have to in commentary. But I think that's mainly for kids listening, for adults that don't want their kids to hear that kind of language. I can kind of understand that the FIA would maybe want drivers to not be coming out in press conferences and swearing, but to receive such a heavy punishment and this sort of community service that Max did after the FIA's end of season awards giving ceremony in Rwanda, that is quite a harsh punishment. And when you're Max Verstappen, the world champion, you're probably a little bit embarrassed by this, because it's such a minor thing when there's so many bigger issues going on in the world of Formula One. For fans, I don't think anyone is offended by Max dropping an F-bomb in an interview. I think, it would have gone under the carpet had it not been made such a big deal by the FIA and then the media who are reporting on the FIA. It's the press conference is live on the TV if you want to watch it. I don't know the viewing figures, but it's not something that most F1 fans will even watch. Only the hardcore F1 fans will tune in and watch that. And we see quotes across publications around the world. It wasn't a big deal. It was made to be a big deal. And it was interesting how the drivers reacted to this. And obviously releasing this statement, asking for talks with the FIA directly from the GDPA was a big statement from the drivers and a kind of a big fight back and them saying, look, we're not going to allow you to make us look stupid and pull us up on this. And since then, they've had talks, and I believe talks are ongoing to maybe come to a bit of an agreement of how things will be taken care of going into 2025.
Well, I guess, now we're going to be watching who's swearing in press conferences in the 2025 season. Jon, the feuding between Max Verstappen and Mercedes' George Russell heated up in December when Russell claimed that Verstappen threatened to put his head through a wall. Can you walk us through what happened here?
Yeah, so it all happened in Qatar. Now, bear in mind that Max Verstappen had won the World Championship in the race before in Las Vegas. So Max Verstappen was feeling very good about things. There was the challenge from Lando Norris throughout the season that kind of came and went as quick as it came there. And I think Max Verstappen's probably more worried about what 2025 will hold. So going into Qatar, Max Verstappen was on pole position. He was then demoted from pole position in favor of George Russell. And this was purely because he was deemed to have been going too slowly while George Russell was coming up behind him during qualifying. Neither of these drivers were on quick laps. It was an interesting decision, but I think it was the way that George Russell spoke during the stewards meeting. Obviously, when you have an incident out on track and it's reported to the stewards, the drivers are then summoned. They have to go and answer for themselves with a team representative. And Max Verstappen here said, and I'll quote him directly, "I've been in that meeting room many, many times in my life and career with people that I've raced, and I've never seen someone trying to screw someone over that hard. For me, I lost all respect." So wow. We don't know what happened. That's obviously a private conversation between everyone involved in that room. But I'm guessing, as any driver would do, George Russell and Mercedes pushed for Max to get some kind of penalty for what they deemed to be an infringement. If you have to look at Formula One teams, they're always trying to get the edge on everyone. I'm sure if it was the other way around, then Red Bull and Max Verstappen would have been doing the same. But for some reason, Max Verstappen has been triggered by this a little bit. Maybe it's his existing relationship with George Russell. And then it's led to a feud that's then gone on to Abu Dhabi, where George Russell has come out and said, and I'll quote him as well, "I find it all quite ironic considering Saturday night he said he's going to purposely go out of his way to crash into me and, quote, put me on my effing head in the wall. To question someone's integrity as a person while saying comments like that the day before, I find it very ironic, and I'm not going to sit here and accept it." So what we can take from that is that 2024 was the year that George Russell decided he wasn't going to take anything from anyone. He then went on to accuse Max Verstappen of being a bully, saying that people have been bullied by him for years. You can't question his driving abilities, but he cannot deal with adversity whenever anything has gone against him, which I think raises an interesting point there, because Max Verstappen is very used to winning. But George Russell wasn't holding back, was he?
But is he telling the truth, Jon? Is Max Verstappen a bully? We know him and Ricciardo had their beef every now and then. He always seems to have an issue with someone.
I think he's just a very blunt and a very precise person with his communications. From what I've heard from other drivers from other series that are good friends with Max and play paddle with him in Monaco and deal with him on a sort of friend basis, being a friend from the same industry they work in, there's no issues there. I think he just knows what he wants. Now he's won multiple world championships. He's obviously going to have a little bit of a chip on his shoulder. He's going to have that extra confidence knowing that he is a 4-time world champion in Formula One. But Max has won wherever he's been, really. So that's been instilled from him from a young age. He's obviously got his dad, Jos Verstappen, in his corner, who, is a big voice and a big supporter of his son, having been a Formula One driver himself. I'm sure that G's Max up as well. But I don't think from my experience and from the journalists I've spoken to that have dealt with Max on a professional level, they sense that he's a bully, but we don't know what goes on behind closed doors. We can only see so much on Drive to Survive. Obviously, Max chose to not be as much of a part of that TV series as some of the other drivers. Maybe that's because he doesn't want the extra scrutiny. He's just not bothered. He just wants to race. We know he's doing sim races the morning of Formula One races. He just loves racing. So maybe stuff goes on behind closed doors. I don't know. But for their relationship there, Max has suggested he's not interested in repairing it at all. He doesn't need to be friends with George Russell, and he called him a backstabber and a loser. So, I mean, I'm sure people have overcome words like that before, but it doesn't seem like he's in a hurry to make amends.
John, just wrapping up the year of scandals, after so much speculation, Red Bull dropped Sergio Perez in December, confirming that Liam Lawson will replace him. I know that you've spoken to Christian Horner, but can you walk me through this decision from Red Bull?
Yeah, so Liam Lawson is someone else I spoke to in the summer, and he was very clear with me that he sees himself being on the grid in 2025. And I've said already in this show, there were rumors that in his contract, there was a clause that meant that if he hadn't been signed up for a full-time seat with Red Bull for 2025 by a certain date, then he could go elsewhere. And when you're a driver that's already done some Formula One races and stepped in at the last minute when he replaced Daniel Ricciardo, he'll have been very attractive to a lot of the teams. So the decision was, I think, made a lot easier by Sergio Perez's form throughout the season, finishing so far behind your teammate here, 285 points behind Max Verstappen in the same car. People will say that the car is designed for Max and it favors his driving style, but it's still one of the most dominant cars, at least for half of the season there. He finished 8th in the standings. That's not really good enough for Red Bull. He was given a new contract in the summer, Sergio Perez, and everyone was a bit confused by that because he wasn't performing. And I think the general consensus in the media is that was done to maybe give him some security, because there were rumors throughout the season that he was going to be replaced. He wasn't cutting it. What was going to happen next? So to give a driver that reassurance for a new 2-year contract, I guess they were hoping it would see an improvement in his performances, but it felt like he did even worse. I mean, Monaco, he was in that collision we've discussed already. The British Grand Prix, terrible qualifying, finished the race 17th, which actually started a run of several races where he finished 17th. Azerbaijan, he out-qualified his teammate Max Verstappen, which is quite rare. Then he had a collision late on, finished 17th. Mexico, a race he's always wanted to win as a Mexican driver, started 18th, had an improper start penalty, which is just, an error that a driver shouldn't be making at this level. Finished 17th, last in the race. So for Sergio Perez, I think the writing was always on the wall. Yeah. And Christian Horner actually explained to us, a couple of weeks ago in December, how they came to make the decision to put Liam Lawson in the car over Yuki Tsunoda, who's obviously been at their sister team for a lot longer.
We felt that Liam's trajectory, together with his mental strength and resilience, were the right assets to partner Max next year, because arguably that seat is the toughest in Formula One, going up against Max Verstappen, who is at the peak of his career.
But what does this look like for Liam Lawson as a rookie, going from F2 to RB reserve to replacing Ricciardo and RB to now joining Red Bull team for 2025? This has been a pretty insane climb to the top.
I think it's a huge opportunity for a driver that has proven that he is good enough, but will be really tested alongside Max Verstappen. Now, obviously, we've heard the diplomatic answer from Christian Horner about why they put Liam Lawson in over Yuki Tsunoda. Fans will continue to argue on the internet about how Yuki Tsunoda should have had that advantage and that he's had more experience. I guess you just have to look at the ceiling that Liam Lawson has and how well he's done as he's come into this championship. He was in F2 and he came third a couple of years ago. He's been in Super Formula over in Japan, which is, one of the most serious championships of single-seaters outside of Formula One. He then steps in for Daniel Ricciardo last year. He then steps in at the end of this season and does all right. I think for next season to be alongside Max Verstappen, he has to balance his quite natural confidence, which some people can see as cockiness, with respecting the fact he's alongside Max Verstappen and he's not going to be seen as the number one driver. That's probably set out from the start. But with some drivers, that can actually be the way you want to work it. We've seen with McLaren this year with Oscar Piastri and Lando Norris. Oscar Piastri is a driver who has won at every level he's done. He's skipped levels of series because he's done so well the previous series. We expect big things from him. We expect him to be a future world champion. When you come to Liam Lawson, he has the clarity at least that he's alongside Max Verstappen, who's the world champion. There's no kind of who's the number one driver situation like they've got at McLaren. And I think Well, it's going to be a really interesting season in 2025 for Liam Lawson to be alongside Max Verstappen, because for Liam, do you go aggressive? Do you try and get big results? Or do you go, well, look, this is my first season in the main Red Bull team, the team that were winning team championships until 2024. And do I play the long game here? Max has made it very clear that down the line, he may not stay in Formula One too long. He may end up moving teams if the stuff behind the scenes at Red Bull goes on. Liam Lawson could work himself, if he has a decent season, into being the number one driver should Max Verstappen leave. So maybe don't rock the boat. However, having met Liam Lawson, having spoken to him several times, he's a very confident, he's a very driven guy. He's got a lot of people behind him. He's got Helmut Marko at Red Bull very, very much in his corner. So they're expecting big things for him. And I think he's going to come into this expecting to really stick it to Max Verstappen in 2025. And I think that's what we all want to see.
Two cocky, confident boys in the Red Bull team, Jon. Jon Jackson, talkSPORT driving reporter, thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks, Maddie.